Episode 20 with Earl.
Where meditation meets daily life, this is the Meditation Freedom Podcast.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the Meditation Freedom Podcast. My name is Earl and I'm your host. And this podcast is all about waking up from turmoil and suffering through tools such as mindfulness and meditation, and why people start a practice with meditation, and why do they continue practicing, and then how do they bring this meditation and mindfulness insight into their daily lives. As you become more conscious and awake, what do you do with that? How do you bring that into your profession, your day-to-day interactions, and the way you look at things? And this is what we're going to be talking about, at least an aspect of it, with our next guest, Earl. And we're going to be talking about how, in his case, he is a construction project manager, and how he brought that into his construction project management by starting to build sustainable design instead of the traditional types of construction. This is really interesting because we're going to be talking also about building with straw bale and basically reducing our carbon footprint. And I like to call it the harm footprint, because harm really includes all of the effects of our footprint, not just the carbon, but also, is it harming somebody? Is it harming animals? Is it harming wildlife, nature? And as I mentioned before, I want to bring on guests that are experienced primarily, because that way they can look back and reflect on their journey to become more conscious and aware and awake, and kind of show us how they did it and what insights they've learned and how they brought that into their daily lives. And of course, I also want to include beginners who are just starting the journey, so that we can always be brought back to a beginner's mind as well. Getting into the guest here for today's show, his name is Earl, and he has been a regular meditator for over 20 years and has been attending meditation retreats with Thich Nhat Hanh since 1997. And currently he is the project manager for the construction of a new nunnery complex at the Deer Park Monastery in San Diego County. And this facility incorporates sustainable design and green building techniques, including straw bale construction. And one of the new approaches to construction management that Ed is talking about and will be talking about in this interview is called collaborative construction. And that's based on open communication, trust, and shared objectives. And these are aspects that are often absent in the current construction industry. So with that, let's get into the interview with Earl. Well, thank you so much, Ed, for joining me in the podcast.
Sure, I'm happy to be here.
Great. How did you get to a path of meditation? I think you mentioned from what I've seen, you started a long time ago. Maybe you can give the audience an idea of what brought you to a meditation practice.
Sure. Yeah, well, it was about 20 years ago. Actually, I was in my early 30s, and I think I was just really going through a period of self-exploration, and I was raised as a Roman Catholic, and I went through 12 years of Catholic school, grade school, and high school. But then after I went to college and graduate school, I kind of, went away from Catholicism. And so I think in my early 30s, I was just really trying to, find some meaning, and started exploring various spiritual traditions, and really started looking into Eastern religions and Eastern philosophy. And my wife and I actually had the opportunity to spend a couple of months in Nepal and India. And so I took several meditation classes there, and yoga classes as well. Right before we left, I found a book on walking meditation by Thich Nhat Hanh. And at the time, I had never heard of Thich Nhat Hanh. but I knew we'd be doing a lot of trekking in Nepal, and so I thought, well, this would be kind of interesting to learn this walking meditation, and maybe I could practice it while we're trekking in the Himalayas. And so I remember having that book on the trip and reading about walking meditation. And then shortly thereafter, when I came back, I found out that Thich Nhat Hanh was having a retreat in Santa Barbara. And so I signed up for that retreat and went on that retreat. And that was in 1997. So what is that, 18 years ago. And that was my first retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh. And since then, I've gone on lots and lots of retreats with Thich Nhat Hanh, and so most of my meditation practice is in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh.
And was there any particular thing about or benefit that you found with these practices that you couldn't get from your other practices and your other spiritual upbringing?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. One of the books that I read by Thich Nhat Hanh is called Living Buddha, Living Christ. And, I really got so much of a deeper understanding of Catholicism and Christianity after reading that book than I felt that I had after, 12 years of Catholic education. And Thich Nhat Hanh does such a great job of explaining Christ consciousness and really putting Christianity and Catholicism in a context that was so much more meaningful for me. Thich Nhat Hanh's approach is not to convert anyone to Buddhism, but to really just help people to become more deeply grounded and strengthened in their own faith, whatever that faith is.
Right. Yeah. Even more connected to their root religion.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Interesting. And at some point during those years, you started learning about some of these things, these mindfulness trainings that Thich Nhat Hanh talks about, and you tried to apply that into your daily life, right? And then at some point you got to struggle with how to integrate that into your work life, into your career.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so I took the 5 mindfulness trainings at the second retreat that I went to in 1999. And, they're trainings, they're guidelines, they're not commandments. And they're really just, guidelines for us to try to live by. But, no one can be, committed to them 100%.
Right.
And one area that I always kind of had a struggle with was the right livelihood part of it. And I've been in construction for 20 years. And, I didn't feel like I was completely out of alignment and in a profession or a career that was, harmful, but I just didn't really feel like I was necessarily practicing right livelihood, or that I really was incorporating any of my mindfulness practices into my profession. And so I just kind of let that go. I just kind of let that dissonance sit there and didn't really try to resolve it much. And it really wasn't until, a little over a year ago when I was asked to get involved in a construction project at Deer Park Monastery in Escondido. And Deer Park is one of the 3 monasteries in the U.S. that was created and directed by Thich Nhat Hanh. And so anyway, I got involved in this construction project that we're going to talk some more about in a little bit. But that was really what then showed me a way to be able to incorporate the 5 mindfulness trainings and more particularly the right livelihood into my daily life and into my professional career and my profession.
Right. And maybe you can explain more about how you went from a certain type of construction method to a mindfulness method. And so people who don't necessarily know about the mindfulness teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh can understand what kind of transformation to go through in order to change that. Sure.
Yeah. So one of the mindfulness trainings is about mindful communication, and it's about deep listening and loving speech. And obviously there's a lot of communication that occurs in construction, but much of it is not necessarily loving speech or deep communication. And so, with this project, I really felt like I had the freedom to be able to try to practice some of these concepts, because my clients are the monastics of Deer Park and follow the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh. And so, I remember from the very beginning, early on when we were bidding the job, one of the contractors that was involved, he came to an initial meeting, and I guess maybe I should step back and kind of explain that
Sure.
initial meeting. When you have a bid meeting for contractors, usually what you do is meet with each of the contractor candidates privately, kind of go through the scope of work with them, and then have them prepare their proposal. And in this case, we decided that we wanted to meet with everyone all together at one time in a group. And we wanted it to really be more of a collaborative and cooperative meeting than a competitive one where all these contractors were coming and felt like they were competing against each other. And so we invited 4 or 5 of our contractors that had been referred to us. We invited them all up to the monastery, and we arranged the chairs so that they would be in a circle. And we decided that we would incorporate some of the practice of mindfulness. And so we began the meeting we had a bell, mindfulness bell, in the center of the room, and we rang the bell. And we explained to the contractors how we use this bell as a way for us to go back to our breath and to recenter ourselves. And so we said, you really don't have to do anything. You just basically, when you hear the bell, if you just close your eyes, bring your mindfulness, your awareness back to your breath, and just kind of follow your breath in and out a couple of times. And, that's the way we'd like to start the meeting. And then during the meeting, at various times, there's bells that go off at the monastery. And we also told them that any time that a bell happens, when a bell rings, we invite people to stop and to go back to their breathing and just recenter themselves. And so it was interesting, here's this room full of these, burly contractors, their big old boots and their Levi's. And, some of them kind of, rolled their eyes and thought,
Right.
oh, what the heck is this? But we tried it. And, some of them, really you could tell they took their deep breaths, they quieted themselves and centered themselves. And you could really see them go inward and really see that, this could be a useful tool for them, especially in a profession like construction where you're always working against deadlines and there's lots of stress and unanticipated circumstances and pressures and things like that.
Right.
So that was the way we started this meeting. And as I said, we all sat in a circle and we talked about how we wanted to work collaboratively, and we wanted to really have everyone work together, and that we really were trying to see if we could incorporate more than one contractor, because we felt like each of them had their own specialties and their own special strengths and things. And so, we sent them home and we said, look, if nothing else, maybe hopefully you've found a new method of stress reduction, and a new way that you can help kind of calm yourself and center yourself when things are hectic and crazy in construction and you're under a deadline or you have a client, screaming at you, or something's gone wrong on the job site. So one of the contractors that we had invited is a custom home contractor, very high quality, high-end custom home contractor. And after the meeting, he came and he approached me and he said, Ed, I looked at the other contractors that were there, and, there's just really, I don't think any way that I can compete against them, because, I'm of a different kind of caliber and I build to a different quality, and I'm just not going to be able to be the low-cost bid. And I told him, I said, Chuck, I think I've been around this practice long enough to know that, the perspective of the monastics here and of Thich Nhat Hanh is, they don't look at things in terms of months and years. They look at things in terms of decades and lifetimes and generations.
Right.
And, they're not looking to just try and build this project for the least amount of money as possible. They're looking at it from a much longer term perspective, and they're looking at it as to, what's going to be best for the monastery as a whole, for the people that are going to be living in these buildings, 50 years from now. And in addition to that, their perspective is not just looking at the costs to them within the monastery, but, the costs of the environment, the costs of the the surrounding areas, and really the impact on the entire world. And again, that's a very kind of Buddhist concept of really looking at how we interrelate and interbe.
Right.
And so I said, Chuck, they're not looking for the lowest price bid. They're not looking for trying to build this thing as cheaply and inexpensively as possible. They're really looking for something that's going to last a long time, and they want the quality and they want the craftsmanship. And I said, so I would really encourage you to bid on, bid the job and bid it the way that you would, with the quality that you think needs to be there and with the type of approach that you would do, and submit your bid and let's see what happens. And he decided to submit his bid, and guess what? He ended up getting the job. So that was just kind of the first introduction to being able to incorporate mindfulness concepts, not just in the way that we structured that initial bid meeting, but even in how the way that we invited the bids and evaluated the various bid proposals.
Wow, that's great. You also mentioned mindful consumption, and how would someone understand that when they've got a choice between building a house just like the typical contractor does with some corner cutting versus a house that's sustainable and healthy?
Right. So just to give a little bit more background, so the sisters actually decided to construct a straw bale structure. So there's 4 structures that we're in the process of building at the monastery, and they're constructed out of straw. So I don't know if our listeners are very familiar with that. This is the first straw bale structure that I've created. I haven't done that before. But for those of you that don't know anything about it, I encourage you to get online and Google it, and you'll find a lot of interesting things about it. And a straw bale structure is really, it's an environmentally sensitive and an environmentally attuned structure for many different reasons. First off, it's in the materials that it uses. The walls themselves are actually, the inside is made of straw, and straw is different than hay. Straw is an agricultural byproduct that's made out of either rice farming or wheat farming. And so these are the dead stalks that are made, and they're cut and stacked and baled into bales, and then the bales are stacked up, and that's what's inside of the walls. So you're using an agricultural waste product and repurposing it and using it within a construction. And in addition to that, we're also using recycled wood and other materials that are in a very green manner. So that's the first aspect, is that the way that the materials that are used. But the second aspect of a straw bale building is the way that, if it's designed properly and designed in a sustainable way, that the way that you can also minimize your energy consumption. Right. Because you have this super insulated structure. And the architect that built our buildings is a firm called Hubbell & Hubbell, and they've designed many straw bale structures here in Southern California. They're a very well-recognized firm, and so they really understand sustainable design. And sustainable design looks at buildings in a different way. For much of my construction career, I've built estate homes. Very large homes, as large as, $25 million homes. Oh. And typically when you're building those kinds of homes, the owner and the architect kind of comes in and they have a cleared spot of land, and they just kind of place the building where they want it to be, and they make the rest of the surroundings kind of serve the building. And in sustainable design and the way that Hubbell & Hubbell approaches it, they look at it completely differently. They look at the prevailing breezes and the way that the sun and the light comes across the land, and they find ways that the structure itself can be designed and placed in such a way that it's compatible with its structure and with its surroundings. And so that's the way that a straw bale building is built. And so it has large overhang eaves, roofs that protect the buildings during the summer and prevent the heat from building up. And then during the winter, it also has large windows facing south, where in Southern California, when the winter sun comes in, it'll actually come in through these buildings and help warm warm the buildings. And then with the super insulated straw bale walls, they'll be able to either keep that warmth during the winter or keep it nice and cool during the summer.
So the heating and cooling costs are going to be way less then, right?
Exactly, right. So you're using a lot less energy, you're causing a much smaller footprint for the building because your heating and cooling costs are down. Also, your lighting costs are down because of the way that the windows are situated. We have lots of solar tubes and sunroofs in the buildings to allow lots of natural light. And so there's really not as much need for electrical lighting. We also have a solar array at the property as well, so that even whatever electricity that we do use is being generated from the sun.
Right. And how do you how does interbeing, how is that, maybe you can explain that a little bit more. How does that fit into this whole construction work?
Sure. Yeah. Well, again, I think Thich Nhat Hanh coined the term called interbeing, which is the concept that everything in the world, everything in life is interconnected. And, I love the story that Thich Nhat Hanh tells about how, when you drink a cup of tea, you're connected to the clouds in the sky. Right. Because the water that's in your teacup actually came from the clouds and the rain in the sky. And so when you're drinking your tea, it's as if you're drinking your cloud. So everything is interrelated. And, in the sustainable design architecture that I was describing, again, you see that everything is interrelated, and you realize that your building structure isn't just on an island sitting by itself, but it interrelates with all of the natural conditions that are around it and designed in that way. Another good example is that we're using a gray water system and a cistern rainwater catch system and a gray water system. And, right now in Southern California, we have a real drought going on here. And, every bit of rain that we can capture is precious. But in a kind of more of a traditional a civil engineering standpoint, everything is designed for storm drains, and it's almost like water is the enemy, and everything is designed to drain off and go off into large storm drains and be funneled off down to the ocean without causing any flooding. As if water is the enemy. But the fact
that's
is
drinking water.
Yeah, right. And but the fact is that water is precious, right. Especially here in Southern California, and it's a commodity that we want to respect and capture and utilize. And so we have catch basin cisterns on the property and the gray water system so that we can reuse the water. And instead of just, shipping it off down into storm drains and off down to the ocean, we're trying to capture and reuse and recycle as much of that water as we can, because we realize that it's connected to our environment, and it's connected to our land, and it's something that we need to realize and recognize to interbe with that water, and to not just treat it as this foreign substance that we want to get rid of and get it off the land as quickly as possible.
Right. And then for the residents that are going to be living there, there's got to be a big difference as well in terms of the comfort and health and well-being that you would get from a building like that. Right.
Exactly. Yes, that's a great point as well. So, one of the things that there's been a lot of press about is the sick home syndromes and all of these man-made materials that we have in our homes today, whether it's fiberglass insulation or high VOC paints with lots of aromas and insulations and sealants, and all of these things are off-gassing all of these fumes into our homes. And, we end up spending so much more of our life indoors these days than we do outdoors. Right. And we're indoors and breathing all of these man-made fumes and all of these pollutants. And when you build a home with straw bale and with natural building products, you eliminate so many of these man-made materials. The rest of the construction of the way that a straw bale structure is made is it starts with the straw inside the walls, but it continues from there. So you don't put gypsum sheetrock and Portland cement stucco on the outside of the buildings and gypsum sheetrock on the inside. Instead, you use earth and clay plaster. because that's what allows the straw to breathe and for the moisture to escape. And so the buildings that we're building at the monastery are built out of earth and clay. And the walls are actually colored with different colors of clay. So the sisters have picked a color scheme, and then we've gone out and found clay that can represent those colors. So there's no paint on the walls. There's no gypsum sheetrock and drywall, and no stucco, no fiberglass insulation. All of these man-made materials that not only off-gas all of these fumes and can cause indoor poor air quality, but if you think about what it takes to manufacture all of these materials and the carbon footprint that's created by manufacturing all of these materials, now you've eliminated all of that. And, the amazing thing is that, we've gone back to the way homes were built 2,000 years ago, right? They're basically being made out of mud and straw. And in the end of the day, 150 years from now, you could basically just knock it down, and that straw and the mud will just be reabsorbed back into the earth.
Yeah, that's amazing. And for the folks who might think, well, doesn't that wash away from the walls? What's the solution for that?
Yeah, that's a great point. So you have to design the buildings in such a way so that they have a large overhang to be able to protect the walls from rain, so that it doesn't wear away the walls. And the earth and clay plaster is easy to patch, and it's easy to reapply. And so unlike a typical drywall wall, where if you were to hang a painting or nail a hole in the wall, when you were done, you'd have to repatch it and texture it, possibly if it's a large enough hole, and repaint it. With an earth and clay plaster wall, you actually just get some more of that earth and clay and a little wet sponge, and you can sponge it together, and it actually is just kind of a self-healing plaster that heals itself.
Oh, that's great.
So one other feature too, that as we're talking about the benefits of straw bale as well, is, and this was really amazing to me when I went into my first straw bale home, is, if you can imagine, these walls are 18 inches thick with solid, dense straw. And so they're just not only amazingly well insulated from a thermal standpoint, but from a sound standpoint as well. Mm-hmm. So when you go into these rooms, there's just a stillness and a quiet that's created by these straw bale structures. And then also, I believe that at some level, at some kind of primordial level, when we walk into a natural straw bale room, our body senses that we are surrounded by natural materials. And so our body just subconsciously relaxes. It's not on alert, because it's not breathing, smelling strange fumes. It's not noticing these foreign man-made materials. And so it just really puts itself at a calmness. And Hubble and Hubble have actually developed that as well in the way that they design the architecture. See, they design everything in very organic proportions. So, for example, at the monastery, none of the walls are straight. They're all curved walls, and the roofs are sloping. And that's because nature doesn't design with straight walls and 90-degree angles. Nature designs with curves and with soft shapes. And so that's the way that Hubble and Hubble have designed these rooms. And so when you go into these rooms, not only are they made of natural materials and super well insulated, but they're also in natural forms. And so when you go in there, your body just feels relaxed, and you feel calm, and you feel centered. And given that we're building these buildings for monastics that are practicing mindfulness and meditation, I can't imagine a better structure to build for this type of practice than a straw bale, naturally designed rooms and structures.
Yeah, very conducive, I imagine. And also, in a way, you're combining 21st century technology with primitive technology. Like, for example, with earthquakes, I imagine that it is up to the 21st century in terms of, the code and all that, right?
It is, yes, it is. And here in Southern California, because we have such seismic activity, we do have to actually build a structure. Most of the straw bale houses are built out of post and beam construction, so you don't have wood studs every 16 inches on center like you typically would. But in this case, actually, we do have to add some steel reinforcements, even though that the buildings are single-story structures. We do have to add some Simpson strong wall and steel walls reinforcements in order to make the structural seismic. But it definitely can be done. And in other areas of the country and the world where it is not as seismically active as Southern California, you can actually even build the straw bale structures without the steel reinforcement.
Mm. You talk about collaborative construction versus competitive construction. Maybe you can unpack that slightly.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the approach that we took towards the construction of this project. And, I'm a professional construction project manager. So my focus is really, I'm building something and focusing on the finished product. My focus is more on the process. So I'm involved in the entire process of building the home or the structures, whatever the project that I'm working on. And so, typically this process in traditional construction is really a pretty competitive process, right? The contractors are all competing against each other. They're very secretive. Everyone submits their sealed bids. The owner doesn't feel like he can really trust his contractor, so he has to go out and get multiple bids so he can make sure that, keep everyone honest. And, it's basically designed in a way that's lacking trust. And it's really built to try to minimize conflict. And, there's always the blame game. If something goes wrong, well, who's responsible,
Right.
And let's make sure that we've qualified it in such a way so that we've clearly defined the roles of responsibility so that when something goes wrong, we know who to sue, And again, because of my practice with Thich Nhat Hanh and with mindfulness and meditation, and I felt, well, I should really walk the talk here, and I know how the monastics live their life and the teachings, the mindfulness trainings that Thich Nhat Hanh has presented, and so let's try to incorporate those into construction. And is there a different way that we can approach construction? And so in the process of working and managing the construction over the last 16 months or so, I've developed a new approach which I call collaborative construction. And collaborative construction is really in stark contrast to the old competitive construction because it's really based on trust, and it's based on cooperation, and it's based on communication. And that really also goes back to what we had talked about at the beginning, which is one of the mindfulness trainings, which is open communication. And, in order to really develop a trusting and open relationship among all of the parties involved in a construction process, it requires really good communication. And it requires people being open and honest and really feeling like they can express themselves in a way, much like that very open and honest communication that I had with that custom home builder when he was going to decline to bid on the job. Mm-hmm. And so really, again, that brings us back to our mindfulness practice of really listening when the other person is speaking, really taking in what the other person has to say, and then, processing that and then responding in a very mindful way. And again, I think also it comes down to trust, and it comes down to realizing that we are all, working together on the same team, and that we really are kind of taking joint responsibility for all aspects of the project. So when things go wrong, and they do, I really try to minimize as much as possible any kind of finger pointing or any kind of blame, and instead just say, okay, well, here's the situation we had. There's really, there's not anyone to blame for this situation. Let's figure out how we can best solve this problem, and let's work together on a way to be able to solve whatever issue that we have.
Yeah, so making it a win-win for everyone.
Right. Yeah. And, again, to go back to the communication, I think, part of that really has come about with really, really good communication. And one of the things that I discovered while I was working on this project is a cloud-based construction project management system. And the way that this works is that all of the information related to the project is stored up in the cloud and accessible by the entire team at any time. So whether it's the blueprints and the plans or the budgets or the correspondence regarding finish selections and various changes along the way, those are all accessible through this one program that I work with. And then everyone can access it. So myself as the construction project manager, my clients, the monastics at Deer Park Monastery, the general contractor, the architect, the subcontractors, everyone can communicate. And when anyone has a question or an issue, it gets brought up onto this cloud-based system so that everyone can understand the issue and everyone can contribute in finding the best and most mindful solution to it.
Yeah, that sounds so much better than separating it out so that you end up having more miscommunications as a result of people not seeing what others are doing. Right,
exactly. And it kind of goes back to your point earlier where it's a kind of a, high-tech, low-tech approach. And, mindfulness and meditation has been around for thousands of years, but we're able to incorporate those concepts and be able to also use very modern technology and cloud-based construction project management systems in order to be able to achieve that deep communication, the deep listening and open communication that we are striving to achieve.
Right. And so as you go into the future with other projects, is it going to be difficult since the mindset and the habits of regular construction industry are not necessarily in alignment with what you're talking about here?
Right.
Is that going to provide challenges?
Well, it's definitely not for every client, and I think it really depends on the client's preferences and the client's values. Now, one thing that I think where it's going to be a great fit is particularly for those people that are really interested in green building and sustainable design, because these clients really have a pretty much broader perspective on their construction project anyway. Right? Mm-hmm. They're looking at it and saying, hey, I want to be mindful of my impact on the environment and my impact on society and how much energy I consume, not only in building the project, but in building my home, but afterwards. Well, I think that someone that's going to take that broader perspective is also going to say, hey, I not only want to be concerned about the impact of my home on the environment, but I want to be concerned about the impact of the building process itself and that impact that's going to have on all of the people that are involved in this. And so in much of the same way that they want to minimize the harmful impact that their home and the materials they use can have, I think by taking a collaborative approach to construction, you can help to minimize the negative impact that the construction process itself has. And I think in the end, ultimately, you can have a much better feeling at the end of the day if you feel that your home was built in a collaborative, cooperative way, and that when it was done, everyone felt that they all contributed together as part of a team, and it wasn't this divisive, competitive process where, in the end of the day, some people felt like they lost and other people gained.
All right, that's great. And would you have any advice for since we're wrapping this up towards the end here, what advice would you have for someone who's struggling right now in their job, and that may not be construction, it may be another type of line of work where they want to bring their mindfulness practice into their daily life? What advice or tips would you have for that person?
Sure. Yeah. Well, when I used to think about how I didn't really feel like I was in alignment with my right livelihood, I felt like I'd have to change careers, or change professions. And I'd have to quit my job in construction and go join a nonprofit and, find some way to make a meaningful difference that way. And instead, what I discovered is that all I had to do was look at things differently. And I didn't need to find a new profession or change my job. I just had to look at things differently. Look at the same things that I did day in and day out, which is managing construction projects, and find a way to do them in a different way. Find a way to incorporate my mindfulness practices into my construction management. And once I realized, hey, how can I communicate in a more mindful manner? How can I create in a more collaborative way? then all of these other things started showing up. I discovered the cloud-based project management system, and I found new ways to be able to communicate. And I had the courage to talk to contractors and subcontractors in ways that I could have never done before, in ways that were much more open and much more trusting. And so I really would encourage any of the listeners out there that are struggling with right livelihood to really start with looking at what you do in a new way, and not to think that you need to go and get into a new industry or find a new profession, but find a way to look at what you do on a day-to-day basis in a different way. Find small ways that you can incorporate your mindfulness and meditation practice into your regular daily life and your daily profession. And I think once you start to look at things in different ways, what you look at changes as well.
Right.
And that's what I really saw in my approach to construction management.
And then different doors open than before.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Because you're looking at things in different ways, and so different opportunities are going to come your way. You're going to see doors that you never saw before because you weren't looking at them in that way.
Great. Well, it's been great talking to you. And do you have any resources that people can follow up on that you would recommend they look at, or maybe your own website as well? Sure.
Yeah. The name of my company is Priority One Projects, and you can find me on the web. And my web address is PriorityOneProjectManagement.com. I'd also encourage you to go on to the Deer Park website as well, and that is deerparkmonastery.org. And if you're interested, I encourage you to take a look at the straw bale structures that we're building. And I also gave a presentation recently at one of the straw bale workshops called Building Zen, and it gives in a little more detail some of the concepts that we talked about here. And that's available both on the monastery website as well as on my website.
Great. I'll make sure I link to that as well. Well, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for your time as well.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this interview with Ed Earl. You can certainly check out the whole interview or most of the transcription by going to meditationfreedom.com/20. And you can also see some of the pictures. I posted some of the pictures that he sent me on the project. And you can also see his YouTube video as well as click on the links to learn more about Ed. So that's it for today, and let me know what you think of this show and the content, and for that matter, anything you want to talk about or you just want to say hi, let me know. Send me an email through the website comments or send me a tweet through Twitter. That'd be great. I love feedback. And if you want to support this show, it's very easy. Just go to meditationfreedom.com/support, and then there are a number of options that you can utilize to show your support. One way would be to leave a review on iTunes. Another way would be to join Patreon, and there's a link on the right, and you just click on it, and you can put a number in there that works for you. And then once a month, you spend a few bucks and you can support this podcast. And I'll make sure that I show my gratitude by posting your picture on a gallery or something like that. And make sure you're one of the first supporters of the show. So with that, best wishes to you and the rest of your week. Take care.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Meditation Freedom Podcast, where meditation meets daily life.